Appropriations Subcommittee on Labor, Health, Human Services, Education, and related agencies will come together. I'm glad to be here this morning with my colleagues, some of whom are joining us from their offices or from some other location. This is the first appropriations hearing being held in person and virtually, and want to thank Chairman Shelby and his staff for letting us try this and see how this kind of information gathering works for appropriators. It's not a markup. There'll be no voting today, but we're going to get some really important information. Yesterday, the new coronavirus cases passed 50,000 for the first time, making it a single-day record. This morning, 128,000 Americans have died, and nearly 2.7 million have tested positive for COVID-V. And, of course, the thoughts of myself and everyone on this committee are with those individuals and those families who've been affected. I've called this hearing really to look at an update on the efforts that the administration's put together, and frankly, members of this committee were very involved in, to see if we couldn't establish a new way to look at responding to pandemics. I think we have the chance to actually write a new important chapter in what that response looks like. Developing the right vaccine, the right therapeutics, the right testing is important. And I think we're going to talk today about ways to try to have all of the safeguards in developing all of those things, but with a federal partner going forward more quickly than we would have ever gone forward today. I saw in reporting this morning that Pfizer is just passed an important mark with the vaccine they're working on. Maybe the most significant thing I saw in that article was that Pfizer believes they may have 100 million doses of that vaccine available by the end of the year. That would be an extraordinary thing if it happens, and I think what we're going to hear from our witnesses today is that there are other companies that would be developing different vaccines that also would add to that figure that might be available late this year or early next year. I think the administration's willingness to take this new initiative, the willingness of the administration, and frankly our Appropriations Committee and the Congress in what we did in the last COVID Act to put some money behind taking a chance, not a chance with an effective vaccine or test, but a chance that we may move forward with something that doesn't work, more to also allow us to move forward early with something that does work. This committee, the full committee, and the Congress has provided nearly $10 billion for this overall effort, and the vast majority of this investment will support the research and development of vaccines and treatments. There are over 100 vaccines in development worldwide. Operation Warp Speed, I believe, is beginning to focus in on about 7 that we would encourage the advancement of into clinical trials and further development. Importantly, as NIH and the Biomedical Advanced Research Development Authority continue to oversee the development of these vaccines, we're also going to be talking today about how manufacturing, for maybe the first time ever, would begin while the vaccine is still going through the other process, and maybe while tests are still going through the other process. As we saw earlier this year with diagnostic testing research at NIH, the current processes can be streamlined to make them faster. Just because something is new doesn't mean it's better, but this is a time to try things and to see what we can figure out to make work. Under the NIH's Shark Tank program that particularly Senator Alexander and I spent a lot of time talking to people at this table about, principally Dr. Collins, but people at this table, manufacturers and others. We're hoping to fast-track diagnostic tests, to have tests that are easier to take with a quicker response, that frankly millions of people can take dozens of times. Getting school started in the fall, at residential campuses and elementary and secondary schools and all other campuses, having a test available will make a big difference. Some people have warned that the timetable to develop both tests and vaccines next year is far too fast. Others have said, well, maybe accelerating the process means that regulatory corners will be cut. We're going to be working really hard to be sure that is absolutely not the case, and I think our leaders here today will help reassure us of what they're doing to see that that doesn't happen. This is an opportunity for our witnesses to explain to our committee and the American people how the development process works, how they'll ensure that the vaccine will be safe, and even with an accelerated research and development timetable, how the vaccine will be distributed across the country as quickly as possible. I've said to several people lately on the topic of vaccine and distribution that obviously developing the vaccine is the top priority, but right below that top priority is having a plan that distributes that vaccine in a way that people believe is fair and equitable and meets the standards that we should be establishing right now. There are clearly concerns about the vaccine. About half of Americans are either reluctant, about 1 out of 5 Americans says they're just not going to take the vaccine. I certainly intend to, and I think most Americans will. And as we reassure people about this process, they'll also think about smallpox and polio and other things that in many cases vaccines have been able to move outside the system because vaccines did their job, and kids in the 4th and 5th grade don't line up any longer so that every single person takes their smallpox shot like they did when most of us were kids. I hope today's hearing really makes an impact on those concerns. I believe it will, and look forward to our witnesses. Senator Murray is here, and I'm going to recognize her for her opening statement. Senator Murray, thanks for being with us today, and thanks for working together to have this hearing.
Well, thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. I really want to thank you and Chairman Shelby for allowing our committee members to participate in this hearing virtually today. And I want to thank all of our committee staff for setting everything up. And I want to thank all of our witnesses who are joining us today as well. Your agencies play a critical role in the development of some of the most important tools against the COVID-19 pandemic: safe and effective diagnostics to identify the cases, therapies to help patients and frontline workers fight this disease, and ultimately a vaccine to move towards ending this crisis. That is why Congress has appropriated more than $6.5 billion to BARDA and $3 billion to NIH for work on medical countermeasures against COVID-19. And we know we'll need more funding, particularly to distribute and promote a safe, effective vaccine down the line. And we also know we're going to need to hold this administration accountable to avoid repeating mistakes and delays. The Trump administration put politics ahead of public health by promoting unproven treatments and steering PPE contracts to unqualified political allies. They failed to plan in a comprehensive way for nationwide challenges like scaling up testing and contact tracing, and ignored and exacerbated existing health disparities that left Black, Latino, and tribal communities to face the worst of this crisis. If we want to get out of this mess anytime soon, the Trump administration has to do better, particularly when it comes to developing a safe, effective vaccine that is widely available. What I hear from experts is that while we all want a vaccine fast, a vaccine that is fast but ineffective will fall short of what is needed to turn the tide on this pandemic. That is why it is more than concerning that the Trump administration sidelined our leading scientists at CDC, removed the head of BARDA, reportedly for putting science and public health over allegiance to President Trump, and took BARDA experts off leadership of contracts related to the search for a COVID-19 vaccine. I also have concerns about why BARDA has chosen to invest solely in new vaccine technologies that have only been studied experimentally and never made it to market, while not pursuing older, proven technologies. Meanwhile, the administration still has not provided any explanation of how it is selecting vaccine candidates, what the risks are of narrowing down that shortlist, or addressed concerns about potential conflicts in contracts that predate this crisis. And it still has not provided a comprehensive national vaccine plan. We saw with testing how the administration's stubborn refusal to plan led to totally avoidable delays. So Congress clearly needs to act to hold President Trump accountable when it comes to vaccines, or risk another inadequate plan that offers too little, too late, or worse, no plan at all. That's why I am working on a proposal to require the Trump administration to provide a comprehensive plan for how it will make sure we get a vaccine that is safe and effective, produced at scale and distributed nationwide, and free and available to everyone in a way that addresses the health disparities this pandemic has made worse. This plan has to ensure that research and development is rigorous, science-driven, and inclusive, and it must lay out specific standards, timelines, and milestones, a commitment to be fully transparent about the clinical trial data experts will use to evaluate safety and effectiveness, and strategies for combating vaccine hesitancy and misinformation. When we finally develop a vaccine, we will need to safely manufacture hundreds of millions of doses for the US alone and billions globally as fast as possible. And that means just as many specialized glass vials, syringes, stoppers, and a lot more. Making all of that happen requires planning to manage the supply chain and navigate challenges like potential bottlenecks. We also need a plan for when we begin to distribute vaccines, to guide critical decisions about who gets the vaccine first, like frontline healthcare workers, high-risk groups, and tackles barriers that could otherwise limit access by making sure the vaccine is free for everyone, and addressing health disparities, which have already made this crisis so much worse for communities of color. And while we need this plan as soon as possible, we also need to be clear about what scientists and clinicians have cautioned, which is that while there is no guarantee a vaccine will be ready by the end of this year, much less by this fall, there are people suffering with COVID-19 right now who need proven therapeutics to help them beat this disease. While a vaccine is our best hope for stopping this virus, it is not our only means of fighting it, nor is it a panacea on its own. So I'm alarmed that while this administration has invested heavily in vaccine development, it is treating other priorities as an afterthought by investing far less in better diagnostics that can identify infections early in the course of the illness and prevent further spread, and pulling the plug on therapeutics that could provide life-saving relief for hospitalized patients at the greatest risk of dying or suffering long-term health effects. Congress provided funding for HHS to invest in a spectrum of medical countermeasures to fight this virus, not just vaccines. We need to invest in every type of medical countermeasure and to do it in a way that benefits everyone in our country equitably, because we know right now this virus is disproportionately impacting communities of colors. For months now, I have been pressing for comprehensive demographic data on access to testing, positive test results, hospitalizations, intensive care unit admissions, and fatalities. And I'm frustrated that we don't have all the data we need yet, but the picture we do have is alarmingly clear. People in the Black community, Latino community, and tribal communities are 3 to 5 times more likely to be hospitalized for COVID-19 than white people. And the death rate for people of color is 2 to 3 times that for white people. Those devastating health disparities are a symptom of a larger pattern of systemic racism and underinvestment in communities of color, and a warning that we need to work as fast as possible on an additional relief package to address those disparities before they get worse, to protect our workers, our students, our families, and continue to support our communities as they fight this historic crisis. We can't know exactly how long until a safe, effective vaccine is widely available, or how long before we can all safely go back to work, back to school, greet our friends with a handshake or a hug. But we do know that the decisions that we make today, whether we prioritize science or not, whether we plan ahead or not, whether we care for every community or not, will make a huge difference in terms of where we are a year from now. So it's absolutely critical we get this decision right. Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. I look forward to the testimony and to our questions today.
Well, thank you, Senator Murray. We've got a great panel today. Dr. Francis Collins, the Director of the National Institute of Health, Dr. Robert Redfield, the Director of the Center for Disease Control, Dr. Gary Dispro, who's the Acting Director of the Biomedical Advanced Research and Development Authority, usually referred to as BARDA. This is Dr. Dispro's first time to testify, but our other two witnesses have been before this committee many times, and it's possible that Dr. Collins may have set the record as a witness before this committee. But Dr. Collins, why don't you start? We have your statements. Try to limit your opening comments to 5 minutes each, and you can do that however you want to, but we're glad all three of you are here, and as you can tell, we're eager to ask questions.
Well, thank you, and good morning, Chairman Blunt, and Ranking Member Murray, and distinguished subcommittee members. I want to thank you for your sustained commitment to the National Institutes of Health. It has enabled NIH to be at the forefront of research to address the COVID-19 public health emergency. I'm grateful for this opportunity to update you on that work. You should have at your place, or if you're on the video connection, maybe an electronic version of a couple of images that I want to point you to in a moment. Over the last 6 months, COVID-19 has spread around the world with frightening speed. To respond to this crisis, we need to find answers to many urgent questions about how to diagnose, treat, and prevent this disease. At NIH, it is our mission to help find those answers using the best science and technology in the world. A critical question is to understand what we are up against. When it comes to new infectious diseases, knowledge is power. And as you can see on the image on page 2 of your handout, and also in this 3D printed model that I brought along with me, which happily was not confiscated by the security people when I entered the building, even though I guess you could say I brought virus to your hearing room. This one will not cause you illness. This model shows you the cause of COVID-19. It's this coronavirus called SARS-CoV-2. Note the distinctive array of these spiky proteins on its surface. When the virus invades the human body, these spike proteins literally open the door to infection. They act as keys that fit into specific locks on the surface of cells. And once inside the cell, the virus takes over its machinery, begins replicating, producing thousands of viruses like itself, and goes on to infect other cells. This can cause severe pneumonia, blood clots, and other life-threatening complications. Now, based on hard work, we now have better means of treating COVID-19 than just a few months ago. Remdesivir and dexamethasone have proven beneficial in rigorous trials and are now standard of care for hospitalized patients. But we have much more to do. Let me say something about testing. Testing in the U.S. has come a long way. More than 30 million tests for presence of the virus have been administered in the last few months, more than in any other nation. Yet these tests, most of which rely on nasopharyngeal swabs and processing in centralized labs, are not entirely satisfactory for the needs at hand. Scaling to rapid, routine point-of-care testing would be a major advantage, but that requires new technology. With that in mind, Congress, on April 25th, provided additional resources for development of new COVID-19 tests. Just 4 days later, NIH launched the Rapid Acceleration of Diagnostics, or RADx initiative, and if you turn to the next page, you'll see there a innovation funnel, which includes a Shark Tank component. This basically is an opportunity for those who've invested and invented new kinds of technologies to put their ideas forward and have them evaluated by a distinguished team of business, engineering, technology, and scale-up experts. In just 2 months, we have received more than 2,400 expressions of interest and over 560 completed applications, most of these from small businesses. Many of these proposed tests use convenient samples like saliva, which would be better than a nasal swab because you could self-collect. Of these, 23 have already made it through the Shark Tank and are undergoing intense validation in what you see here as phase 1, preparing for possible massive scale-up in phase 2, and we expect to have at least one of these technologies into phase 2 within the next week. By fall, we expect that the winning technologies will make it possible to deploy several million more tests each week. In fact, I would say maybe more than 1 million more each day. But it's not enough to diagnose the disease. We must treat it as soon as possible to prevent it. To that end, on your next page, you'll see NIH has launched the Accelerating COVID-19 Therapeutic Interventions and Vaccines, that will be an acronym, ACTIV, A-C-T-I-V, initiative. This initiative is shown here, and the handout provides a high-level overview of the organization of this remarkable and unprecedented public-private partnership involving 18 biopharmaceutical companies, academic experts, and multiple federal agencies. In 2 short months, ACTIV has developed 5 master protocols that will accelerate research trials and hasten FDA review and possible approval. These will rigorously test a series of antivirals, anticoagulants, immunomodulators, and monoclonal antibody treatments in both inpatient and outpatient settings. Supported by Operation Warp Speed, we expect 4 treatment trials to get underway in the next 6 weeks, and we're quite excited about their potential for success. But still, the ultimate tool we need to end the COVID-19 pandemic is a vaccine. Operation Warp Speed and the ACTIV Initiative are working together intensively on vaccine development. A scientific review of more than 50 candidates has already been conducted. The furthest along in U.S. testing, shown on page 5, is an experimental vaccine from NIH's Vaccine Research Center in partnership with Moderna. This vaccine features a small, non-infectious snippet of messenger RNA. Injecting this mRNA into muscle spurs a person's own body to make the viral spike proteins, which in turn will encourage the production of protective antibodies against SARS-CoV-2. A phase 2 clinical trial of this vaccine candidate began on May 29th, and this month we plan to launch a phase 3 clinical trial that will seek to enroll 30,000 volunteers with results expected in a few months. So clearly, we've already learned much about this devastating virus, and we've made significant strides at unprecedented speed in developing diagnostics, therapeutics, and vaccines. Yet far more work is needed to end this global health crisis. With your support, NIH is on the case. So thank you for this opportunity, and I look forward to your questions.
Thank you, Dr. Collins. Dr. Redfield.
Good morning, Chairman Blunt, Ranking Member Murray, and members of the subcommittee. I'm pleased to be here today with my HHS colleagues. Together, we are working on the critical issues related to COVID-19 vaccine development, manufacturing, and distribution under the auspices of Operation Warp Speed. Vaccines are one of public health's greatest scientific achievements. With the support of Congress, investments in CDC's domestic and global immunization programs continue to diminish disease threats and advance the human condition. Most importantly, vaccines save lives. Preparing for the implementation of a safe, effective COVID-19 vaccine program is a critical next step. Through our existing influenza vaccine program, CDC continues to work with state, tribal, local, territorial health partners to prepare and maintain public health distribution pipeline. This includes training personnel, building strategic relationships, utilizing data systems, identifying the resources to sustain an efficient and effective immunization infrastructure. Leveraging the existing system, CDC stands ready to support our partners with the distribution once a COVID vaccine is available. Each year, CDC safely distributes vaccine from manufacturers to nearly 40,000 public and private health providers across the nation, and in a typical year, we provide vaccine for more than 80 million individuals. During an emergency, this system has the ability to scale and the capacity to manage and distribute up to 900 million vaccine doses. This is possible because CDC has established an extensive integrated network inclusive of public health departments, health providers, and community-based groups that extend far and wide. Drawing on the lessons from 2009 H1N1 pandemic, we've identified critical considerations for rapid deployment of a new COVID vaccine. Distribution strategies will be based on many factors. One strategy likely will be prioritizing who is vaccinated. The goal is to ensure that vaccine access for all Americans who could benefit from vaccination. To do this, we must consider the logistical aspects of where vaccines are administered and who's administering. Monitoring systems will be required to document vaccination, manage inventory, and gauge vaccine supply nationwide. CDC currently manages the supply through its vaccine order system and collects vaccine coverage data from jurisdictions to help them make informed decisions. CDC's Immunization Safety Office has a long-standing history of monitoring the safety and efficacy of vaccines and will continue to provide leadership in this area. Scientifically based vaccine policies are the foundation of the U.S. immunization system. These policies are formulated by recommendations from the Advisory Committee on Immunization Practice, or ACIP, and then provided to me as CDC Director. Another key component is the efficient distribution strategy to ensure that people have clear and accurate and ample information on vaccines so they can make informed decisions about getting vaccinated. Experience has shown us that vaccines are powerful tools, and reaching every individual who could benefit from immunization is an important goal. A successful vaccine program will require a combination of traditional and new innovative approaches to how to administer and deliver vaccines. Pharmacies and other complementary community locations will be more important during our response to this pandemic. And finally, public health considerations have to look at the management of the vaccine itself. Every vaccine has requirements for storage and handling that must be addressed for the vaccine to be effective when delivered. Ensuring the cold chain, the system that maintains the vaccine's integrity from when it's manufactured to when it's administered. To meet these aggressive goals, it's going to be important to enhance our nation's cold chain infrastructure. In the coming months, we will be confronted with the confluence of COVID-19 and seasonal flu. CDC is working to encourage the Americans to embrace flu vaccination with confidence. This is an important public health goal and serves two important purposes for COVID-19. First, increasing flu vaccine coverage can reduce the strain on our health system, which we've already seen in some areas from COVID-19. Second, the flu vaccine uptake is another opportunity to test our systems and infrastructure that will need to be leveraged during a COVID-19 vaccine delivery program. As we confront to fight the pandemic, it's important that all Americans have confidence in all vaccines. Through the CARES Act, CDC was provided $140 million in funding to support states and local departments for early planning of the flu-influenza season and to enhance these immunization programs across our nation. COVID-19 is the most significant public health challenge that our nation has faced in more than a century. In the absence of vaccine and countermeasures today, we are implementing effective public health measures and encouraging the adherence to what I've referred to as the powerful weapons of social distancing, face coverings, and hand hygiene. In doing so, I'm confident that we will emerge from this pandemic united together, stronger than ever. I encourage you to see the possible as both the public and private sectors pursue a vaccine and that we as a nation confront this pandemic globally. Thank you, and I look forward to your questions.
Thank you, Dr. Redfield. Dr. Dispro.
Chairman Blunt, Ranking Member Murray, and distinguished members of this committee, thank you for the opportunity to testify today. I want to highlight how BARDA is supporting efforts to develop vaccines, treatments, and diagnostics in response to the COVID-19 pandemic. BARDA is a unique government organization created to bridge the valley of death between basic research and late-stage development of products, vaccines, therapeutics, and diagnostics, collectively called medical countermeasures, to address 21st century health security threats. In its brief 13-year existence, BARDA has formed over 300 industry partnerships and supported products that have received 55 FDA approvals. BARDA staff are experts in government contracting and in pharmaceutical and diagnostic development, many with over 25 years of experience working in the pharmaceutical industry. BARDA has a track record of success in delivering effective medical countermeasures in response to public health emergencies. Past examples include H1N1, Ebola, and Zika. BARDA has unique authorities allowing my organization to leverage and rapidly expand partnerships to push candidates forward to the review, testing, and approval phase. BARDA's longstanding expertise in accelerating the advanced research and development of candidate diagnostics, therapeutics, and vaccines is a testament to this dedicated and experienced team. I want to thank my BARDA colleagues as they work long hours and weekends to support this response. In a typical fiscal year, BARDA's highly experienced contracting professionals invest approximately $1.6 billion to support the development of MCMs to address chemical, biological, radiological, and nuclear threats and pandemic influenza. This year, in addition, in just 3 months, we have obligated over $3.5 billion as part of the COVID-19 response. BARDA has leveraged funds provided under the CARES Act and additional funds from HHS to invest in multiple vaccine candidates, multiple therapeutic programs, and multiple diagnostics. 12 diagnostics have been granted emergency use authorization by the FDA. The BARDA COVID-19 portfolio now supports over 40 projects. When HHS Secretary Azar declared a public health emergency in January, BARDA immediately responded. ASPR BARDA established an interagency call with industry, highlighting our high-level strategy for the development of vaccines, therapeutics, and diagnostics to address COVID-19, attracting over 1,500 participants. That same day, BARDA opened a medical countermeasure portal to accept market research submissions from stakeholders, receiving over 3,300 submissions to date. Prior to receiving supplemental funds, BARDA modified our 2 solicitations to allow for submissions of COVID-19 specific products. To date, we have received over 267 submissions under our broad agency announcement, or BAA, and 426 to our easy BAA, a streamlined solicitation with a cap of $750,000 in funding. This is what we do. We engage innovative stakeholders, establish partnerships, develop medical countermeasures, and bring them forward to the American people to save lives. Early in the COVID-19 outbreak, BARDA developed our strategy for medical countermeasure development. For vaccines, our strategy was to engage with vaccine manufacturers, developing different platform technologies, some already licensed by the FDA or nearing licensure, and who had established manufacturing processes to quickly manufacture large quantities of vaccine. Our therapeutic strategy was similar: invest in multiple technologies and to increase our chances of success. For diagnostics, our strategy was to invest in multiple technologies: molecular, antigen, and antibody-based tests. Prior to the first COVID supplemental, BARDA made initial investments in the development of vaccines, therapeutics, and diagnostics using our existing funding and authorities. This early strategy has partially served as the basis for Operation Warp Speed Strategy, or OWS. OWS is an unprecedented collaboration between the Department of Health and Human Services and the Department of Defense to expedite development of vaccines, therapeutics, and diagnostics and bring them to the American people. OWS aims to deliver up to 300 million doses of safe and effective vaccines for COVID-19 in early 2021 as part of a broader strategy to accelerate the development, manufacturing, and distribution of COVID-19 vaccines, therapeutics, and diagnostics for the American people. BARDA is a key component of OWS along with various NIH institutes, the CDC, and DoD. The primary goal of OWS is to develop safe and effective medical countermeasures. As a USG effort, we will need to take financial risks to expedite the development of vaccines and therapeutics. The key to success is to invest in multiple candidates and support parallel development activities to meet the expedited timelines. The risk is purely financial, a financial risk of manufacturing large amounts of medical countermeasures while we're still determining the safety and efficacy. We will not risk the safety of these products. This financial risk is necessary to ensure MCMs are available for use as soon as the FDA has deemed them safe and effective. Some of our investments will be in products that do not make it. This is the financial risk that we must take because the risk in lives lost and the impact to our economy is far greater. This committee and Congress at large have been very supportive of BARDA and our mission, and we are very thankful. Today, more than ever, we need your continued support and flexibility to ensure our staff can stay focused on the task at hand. I look forward to discussing how we can work together on this important issue. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Dr. Despro. We're going to do our best to stick with the 5 minutes that every member has. There'll certainly be a second round, and everybody's going to be dissatisfied at the end of their first 5 minutes with what they didn't get to ask, but the person that follows them will be particularly satisfied that they stayed close to the 5 minutes. Dr. Collins, Dr. Despro just said we would risk no safety. There'd be no product, even if produced, that would ever be available that wasn't safe. Do you have any concerns that on the vaccine side that FDA is not going through every safety step that they would normally go through?
Mr. Chairman, I have no concerns, and I'm deeply engaged in this whole process, working with Operation Warp Speed. I think the ability to do things so quickly is not compromising safety. It's taking advantage of other areas where we can speed things up, even though it may involve doing manufacturing at risk when we don't know yet whether that vaccine is going to work, and ultimately throw out a lot of what gets manufactured if it doesn't work. But there will be no compromise at all on the safety and the efficacy standards. That is absolutely clear.
Dr. Disper, let's follow up immediately. You mentioned the risk factor, and Dr. Collins just said we will throw out anything that's produced that doesn't go through the final certification of safety and efficacy. Tell us a little more about that process. So and I also noticed you said we were engaged in review, testing, and the approval phase. Are we engaged yet with anybody in the manufacturing phase?
We are fully engaged with multiple companies in the manufacturing phase. Under Operation Warp Speed, we're investing in a diverse array of technologies, different technologies, because we're uncertain of which vaccine technology may produce a safe and effective vaccine. We are doing, as Dr. Collins mentioned, manufacturing at risk. This is a risk that we have to take if we want to expedite the timeline. So there is a reason that the FDA is not part of Operation Warp Speed. They are an independent regulatory body, and they will review the safety and efficacy. But we will manufacture at risk large volumes of vaccine, and there is the potential that if those vaccines do not prove to be efficacious in phase 3 studies, that we would not move forward with that vaccine.
All right. Every time I hear at risk, and I'm pretty comfortable with vaccines, I think, oh, somebody's hearing at risk. I don't think we can emphasize enough that what we're risking is losing some money that we invested to move multiple products forward, so that when the products that did get through the whole process would be available at maybe roughly the same time they're finally approved for use. Nothing will be more frustrating in this moment than for FDA to certify a product and then hear it's going to be months before that vaccine would be available. And am I right in believing that that's what those months are what you're trying to avoid through BARDA?
That is correct. Again, under the entirety of Operation Warp Speed. But yes, BARDA is investing in multiple vaccine candidates, and you are exactly right. It is a financial risk. It is not a safety risk, and we are manufacturing, and the government is assuming that financial risk.
And I'm sure we're going to talk more about specific money later, but remember, we've already invested $3 trillion to try to fight the virus and save the economy. If somehow we lose $3 billion in an effort to get both of those fights in the right place quicker, I think we all ought to be willing to eagerly talk about the fact that, frankly, if we don't lose some money, we didn't try hard enough. If you choose 6 vaccines and they all make it, I think the question would be, well, why didn't you choose 8 vaccines? Because, again, Dr. Dispro pointed out that all of these vaccines will be slightly different than the other vaccine. When you get a vaccine for COVID, and am I right in assuming that people will not all get the same vaccine in all likelihood for their COVID vaccine?
So there's the potential. Again, we're investing in multiple candidates. We hope to develop 1 or more safe and effective vaccines. If there are 1 or more safe and effective vaccines, there is the potential that one vaccine may work better in a certain population than the other vaccine. But we will continue to evaluate those through the safety and efficacy trials, the phase 3 trials.
And Dr. Redfield, I'm going to come back to you later on this question, but in your view, who is responsible for the plan for distribution in the current structure?
Thank you for the question, Mr. Chairman. This is really the center space for the CDC. As I mentioned before, we're currently involved in the distribution of a variety of vaccine programs throughout this nation. So this is really the prime responsible of the CDC to work in coordination to take advantage of some of the logistical capabilities of the Department of Defense. But this is really CDC's prime responsibility.
Thank you, Dr. Redfield. Senator Murray.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. Thank you to all of our witnesses today. Dr. Redfield, this crisis, as we all know, will not end until we do have a safe and effective vaccine that can be widely and equitably distributed. On Tuesday, you agreed that we need a comprehensive national plan whose implementation will hinge on the ability of public health agencies to deploy a vaccine to every community once it is available. CDC's decades of experience managing a national immunization program have to be central to that planning. I think I just heard you answer Chairman Blunt, but under Operation Warp Speed, does CDC lead the planning for the immunization infrastructure and distribution, or is that in any way the Department of Defense responsibility?
Thank you very much for the question, Senator Murray. Again, it's leveraging, we're going to leverage the logistical capability of DOD with obviously the experience and central role that we play in distribution with our state, local, tribal, territorial, community partners around the nation. So again, as I said to the chairman, this is CDC's lead with the logistical support of the Department of Defense.
Has the DOD ever managed vaccine distribution at this kind of scale before?
I would have to refer that question to the Department of Defense, but I can just reiterate what I mentioned, that CDC has a system in place that we use routinely. And in
okay, well, I'm going to move on, but that's a question that's important here. Let me ask you, CDC hasn't used funding from any of the supplemental appropriations bills to prepare for a mass vaccine distribution campaign. Can you tell us why that is?
I'm sorry, Senator, I didn't quite understand the end of...
CDC has not used any of the funding of the supplemental appropriations bill that you've been given to prepare for a mass vaccine distribution campaign, and I want to know why that was.
Yeah, Senator, I'd have to have our group get back to you, but we've expended a substantial amount of the money that Congress has provided us. I know I've moved out over $12 billion already to state, local, territory, tribal health departments to begin to augment their public health capacity. So I would need to get our team to get to the specifics of it. We moved out the $140 million that you gave us to help us improve influenza vaccination.
Yeah, you've used that for flu vaccine, important, but the lack of preparation for COVID-19 vaccine distribution is concerning to me, and it doesn't sound to me like CDC is leading that effort. So, Mr. Chairman, I will move on, but I do need an answer. I think we all do to that question. Dr. Disbrow, last month, HHS announced a $628 million deal with Emergent Biosolutions to help manufacture the eventual COVID-19 vaccine. As the second largest award in the government's COVID-19 response, that deal cemented Emergent's dominance as the highest paid contractor for the HHS Office of the Assistant Secretary for Preparedness and Response. A Washington Post investigation revealed that before the pandemic, ASPR paid Emergent more than double what it paid any other contractor. Dr. Cadleck, who oversees ASPR, consulted for Emergent as a strategic advisor for years and was once part owner of a biodefense company with Emergent's founder and chairman, a connection, by the way, that he failed to disclose to the Senate during his confirmation process in 2017. So, Dr. Disbrow, this is my question to you today. Can you say with 100% confidence that companies are awarded BARDA contracts based solely on scientific merit and not their personal relationships?
Yes, I can.
Okay, well, it was reported yesterday that 3 companies making coronavirus drugs and vaccines removed standard language from their contracts with BARDA that give the government, quote, march-in rights to intervene in cases of unreasonable drug prices. I'm very concerned that pharmaceutical companies have dictated the terms of BARDA contracts and watered down the government's march-in right protections. At a time when we are spending billions of dollars in vaccine development, why did we weaken our ability to ensure fair vaccine pricing?
So I appreciate the question, Senator. So for the U.S. government to use march-in rights requires a very high threshold. The U.S. government can ask the holder of the IP to grant a non-exclusive, partial exclusive, or exclusive license to a responsible applicant, and if that does not move forward, then the U.S. government may grant that license. However, the contractor has to show that they are not, or expected to not, within reasonable time achieve practical application of invention. That is not occurring. We are all working very quickly to push forward with the development of vaccines and therapeutics. Action is necessary to alleviate health or safety needs not reasonably satisfied by the contractor. I also do not believe that threshold has been met. So again, under BARDA contracts, we work under the federal acquisition regulations. We do have some contracts which are called other transactional agreements, which are outside of the FAR, but we always, everything is based on science and to protect the federal government's investment.
Mr. Chairman, respecting time, I just want to say this. We are spending billions of dollars in vaccine development. We should not be weakening our ability to ensure fair vaccine pricing for the people of this country. Thank you.
Thank you, Senator Murray. Chairman Shelby.
Thank you. I'll address this to all three of you. Where are we today? The American people are watching this hearing. We believe that we have sent you enough money. If we haven't, tell us why not. But tell us where we exactly are, if you can be exact, on coming up with a vaccine. I think the vaccine, I know you're trying every approach in the world, logical approach, and you got a lot of people working on it, but the American people are dying and getting sick, and they're looking for results, and we know you just can't just wave the magic wand. Dr. Collins, I'll start with you. What can you say to the American people today of where we are and when the timeline, and what do you think we will be, where?
Yeah, Mr. Chairman, this is the right question and something that I think all of us working on COVID-19 are obsessed about night and day, because this is one of those crises where science is not only important, it's crucial, and every mistake we make would set us back, and every wasted opportunity would have a consequence for somebody's life. So I want to tell you, we are all in, everybody working on this warp speed team, where we are with the vaccine. Remember that generally it takes 5 to 10 years to develop a vaccine from a new infectious agent. We don't have that time. So in record time, the very first vaccine went from knowing what the sequence of this viral genome was to injecting the first patient in a phase 1 trial in 63 days. That's a world record by a long shot, because of new technologies that made that possible. And then going quickly from the phase 1, which looks very promising, to phase 2, which started on May 29th, and phase 3, which will begin this month. And how long will that take? We need to enroll 30,000 volunteers, and that should take a matter of some months. We are all optimistic that the goal that we have set to have a vaccine that works and is safe by the end of 2020 will be met by one of the vaccines. I've just mentioned one, but of course there's several all being conducted side by side. And that we would then have, by early 2021, 300 million doses of a vaccine that's safe and effective. So all of that is where we're putting ourselves on the line, and I think everybody at this table would agree that's really a stretch goal, but it's the right goal for the American people.
Dr. Redfield.
Thank you, Chairman. Two comments. First and foremost, the most important thing as we move forward with these vaccines, as was said before, is that our role at CDC, again, along with others that are here and FDA, is to ensure that they're safe and efficacious. Where we are right now, the two areas that we have the most important role is to figure out how to get that vaccine into the individuals that would benefit from it. So two things there: building vaccine confidence. We talked about that.
But that's presupposing you come up with a vaccine, right?
Yeah, I think we have to start working on that right now.
Absolutely.
We are working on that right now, Chairman, just because the complexity of giving a new vaccine to the American public, as we learned during the H1N1 in 2009, it's seriously complicated. And so we are working on that, if you will, distribution mechanism now, and we were working on building the confidence in the American public now with the supposition that our colleagues that are evaluating the actual vaccine itself, between their 7 shots on goal or as many different vaccines as they're developing now, that one of those vaccines will come and show an adequate safety and efficacy profile to go forward and be distributed.
Dr. Disbrow.
Thank you, Senator. So building off the previous comments, I think we look at incremental success as we're moving along. You saw some results yesterday. Pfizer published results from a phase 1 clinical trial. I think those are important to get out to the American people. Initiation of phase 3 clinical trials. It's already been reported by one of the companies that we're working with. They will initiate their phase 3 trial, as Francis said, in July. There will be additional phase 3 trials that are staggered later in the summer. I think those are important milestones to let the American people know that we are making progress. In addition is the scale-up in manufacturing and validating those process. That is a critical milestone as well. So where we are right now is we're in the phases of the different clinical trials, phase 1, phase 2, phase 3, and we're ramping up manufacturing.
Dr. Collins, how much cooperation around the world, since so many nations and so many people are affected, are the researchers collaborating on, and what are they getting?
Science has always been an international effort, and never more so than when we're faced with a global pandemic. I think the collaboration and cooperation is really excellent. One of the vaccines we're talking about actually was originally developed in the United Kingdom, has now been embraced in a way that the U.S. can take advantage of it also with support from BARDA's a very excellent way of doing those negotiations. So yeah, we are looking in every nook and cranny for the kinds of collaborations and cooperation that will make this go faster. That's our scientific tradition.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Senator Shelby. Senator Durbin.
Mr. Chairman, I want to follow up on Senator Murray's question. We're in the middle of a national pandemic. We're also in the middle of a national presidential campaign. And I think her question goes to the fundamental, basic desire for testimony here on where we stand in terms of the political world before we address the medical world. I'd like to ask the three witnesses here if any of them have felt any pressure, political pressure, from the White House or other agencies in terms of the selection of the companies to develop a vaccine, the timing of the vaccine development, the announcement of a vaccine, or any other aspect that is part of your responsibility on the medical side?
No, sir, no political pressure. Lots of internal pressure as a physician and a member of the world to try to find the answers.
Dr. Redfield?
Senator, my answer is no.
Mr. Distro?
My answer is no as well. I'm a scientist, not a politician.
Thank you. That's what I was hoping for, and I think that's what the American people are looking for. And so let me go to the next question on the medical side. And here is where I think we have to have some candor. When I'm told that the phase 3 clinical trial of the Moderna vaccine that's being conducted by the University of Illinois at Chicago will kick off in about a week, and they anticipate that it will last 2 years before they've completed it, collecting information from all of the people who volunteered for the test, blood samples, and the like, to determine the safety and effectiveness of that vaccine. I find it difficult to square that reality that's been announced in their phase 3 clinical trial with the promises that I'm hearing over and over again that within 12 months we're likely to have a vaccine. It suggests to me that the phase 3 clinical trial, which ordinarily takes 2 years, is going to be somehow abbreviated. Now, I understand the emergency use authorization at FDA that may be utilized to choose a vaccine and go into production and distribution of such a vaccine, but that has had at least some mixed results recently when it came to the hydroxychloroquine EUA that was announced. So how do we maintain the confidence of the American people of the safety and effectiveness of vaccine if it appears that we are shortcutting this phase 3 clinical trial that is usually required in these vaccine circumstances?
Senator, maybe I can help explain why that 2-year time interval might have been there in terms of the assessment of the vaccine. Again, what we need to know as soon as possible is, does this vaccine, when administered to people who currently are not infected but are likely to get exposed, does it protect them from becoming infected? So each of the vaccine trials will aim to enroll 30,000 participants, half of whom will get the vaccine, half of whom will get a placebo. And we will watch then as these individuals, and they're going to be particularly recruited in areas where the vaccine is currently spreading, either get infected or don't. And it will only take about 126 episodes where somebody with the placebo gets infected and somebody with the vaccine doesn't to know that this has worked. That will be the point where you'd be happy to say this now has efficacy, and of course you'll also have a lot of people to see if there was any safety signal. The reason, though, to prolong the study after that has already been achieved is a number of other things. Are there any long-term side effects that weren't anticipated? We don't think so, but you'd want to be able to follow. And also, how durable is this particular immunity? Is this vaccine going to be something that works for life, or will you need a booster in a year or two? Hence the reason to extend the timetable.
But doctor, if I'm going to make the decision, good news, 126, whatever it happens to be, in a span of 3 or 4 months, here's your vaccine. If I'm going to make that decision, what you're telling me is the phase 3 clinical trial still has elements, important elements in my decision-making process to be resolved, which are going to take time in terms of the long-term impact of the vaccine. Is that correct?
And that is actually the way we do a lot of trials of drugs, not just vaccines, where you assess whether the drug is safe or effective in a circumstance where you really need a treatment. But then you don't stop looking. Once FDA has given an approval, you carry out long-term studies to make sure there's not some unexpected result or the drug stops working. So that's basically the plan here with vaccines as well. We don't want to miss the chance to collect that downstream data.
Dr. Collins, are you familiar with the Cutter vaccine issued?
I am.
Dr. Salk and polio vaccine?
Yes.
Can you reflect on that for a moment of what the world of vaccine development looks like today compared to then?
Well, yes, that was a terrible tragedy in a circumstance where a vaccine actually turned out not to be fully inactivated and therefore created actually the illness that it was supposed to prevent. I think I could reassure you and the American people that that strategy of trying to administer a killed vaccine is not currently being pursued for SARS-CoV-2 because of those risks. Instead, the vaccines choose to produce just a small component of the virus. I think I showed this before. These proteins, these spike proteins that sit on the surface, that's what the vaccine produces. There's no intact vaccine, no intact virus there at all. But yet you can still generate the immunity. So the Cutter experience, which was a terrible tragedy, is really not possible with the way these vaccines are being designed.
Thank you.
Thank you, Senator Durbin. Senator Alexander.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you to the witnesses. We've been talking about vaccines, and next year I'd like to talk about tests and treatments and this fall, which is only a few weeks away. Let's start with tests. Dr. Collins, with all the depressing news we hear about COVID-19 for the last several months, Americans are hungry for sports. So will there be enough COVID-19 tests so we can watch some football this fall or some basketball this winter? I noticed the National Hockey League said it was going to test every player every day. The president of Brown University told our committee that she wanted to test every student before they come back. Admiral Giroir has said that the country will have 40 to 50,000 test capacity by September. That will probably be enough to have widespread testing to go back to school and back to work. But will it be enough for sports teams to take the field? Probably the answer lies with your RADx effort to make a new way of creating quick, reliable diagnostic tests that can be administered frequently, maybe even every day. So we'll be able to watch some football and some basketball this year, or do we have to wait till next year?
Well, I'm probably the least qualified sports fan, but I do appreciate that this is important to a lot of people. And we want to see Americans have a chance to have some normal experiences of enjoying life. I do believe this should be possible. What RADx is doing, and appreciate the strong support from this Congress to make this possible, is to speedily put together these kinds of point-of-care tests that can be done on-site, can give you a result within an hour, and can tell you immediately whether that person is actually infected with the SARS-CoV-2 virus, in which case they can be immediately quarantined. And I think the general sense is, for athletic teams, you really need to know that. Otherwise, you're going to have an outbreak that will wipe out the entire team.
But your goal is to have these tests available this fall?
Yes.
September? That's your goal.
That is the goal. The path we are on right now, and again, this is a white-knuckle goal because it's never been done at anything like this kind of timetable before, would be to have an additional 1 million tests per day available for the kind of point-of-care, on-the-spot testing that's very much needed for going back to school and going back to sports events.
And these would mostly not be the tests that have to be shipped off to a lab and then come back.
That is our goal. Or if they're going to be shipped to the lab needs to be very nearby. We are aware that there are places where there are labs that have instruments that could be brought to bear on this that are widely distributed already but haven't been adapted to this purpose. That would be sort of a next best thing, is to have them at least in your own local arena. The best, of course, is to have your gadget right there at the front desk when somebody shows up for practice and find out, is this person somebody who's safe to send to the field?
Okay, that's this fall. Now let's go to treatments and medicine. I think Senator Kennedy may be here. He said in his inimitable way that he thinks what people are really afraid of with this virus is not just getting it, but that they might die. And they might die or have a very severe illness because there's no medicine for it, except you mentioned 2 that have been approved by the FDA. So as we go back to school, for example, with 75,000 students going back to elementary and secondary school, we're happy that COVID-19 doesn't seem to affect children very much, or even college students very much. But there is the danger that they might infect their teachers or their older administrators, or they go home to their parents or their grandparents and might infect them. Exactly. So what can you say to the teachers and the administrators and the parents and the grandparents about medicines that this fall will help them not die and not have a severe an illness? What will be available this fall when the kids go back to school?
Well, there are intense efforts to expand that repertory from remdesivir and dexamethasone, which are already approved, as you mentioned, to other kinds of ways to do effective treatment. A big promise here is the use of what you might call passive immunization, where you basically provide to somebody who's ill antibodies derived from somebody who has survived already. And this is the idea behind convalescent plasma, which is being rigorously studied and right now analyzed by the FDA to see what the results have been. But even more than that, one could develop what are called monoclonal antibodies.
As this is so-called antibody cocktail of the kind that was developed and approved by the FDA with Ebola?
Exactly, and it worked for Ebola. It worked really well. And the idea is you have these antibodies taken from somebody who has survived the disease, and you turn that into a product. And those trials are going to get started this month.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Senator Alexander. Senator Shaheen.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Good morning, and thank you all for being here, for your testimony, and for your service to try and address what is obviously the worst threat to Americans in my lifetime. I am particularly concerned about the impact on older Americans and those in long-term care facilities. In New Hampshire, 80% of our COVID-19 deaths had been in long-term care facilities. That's the highest percentage in the country. I'm concerned, as you talked, Dr. Redfield, about how you prioritize who gets the vaccine when we have one. How do you prioritize these residents and those with underlying conditions like diabetes?
Thank you very much, Senator. A very, very important question. Obviously, this is going to be discussed through our advisory committee on immunization practices, but clearly the most vulnerable and those individuals that are at greater risk for mortality have to be highly considered, as well as those individuals at great risk for infection because of what they do. Turns out among healthcare workers that get infected, we've recently looked at it, turns out the most common healthcare workers that got infected were the non-nurse, the sort of the caregiver in the nursing home were the most common there. So these are going to be critically important. I will say one thing though, depending on which vaccine is approved, it may have particular characteristics that make it more or less appropriate to begin with in different populations. And this is why I think it's hard for us to know exactly until we know
Sure.
which of the viruses. But clearly, the vulnerable are going to be, if not the top priority, one of the top priorities.
And do you have a timetable for when you're going to make those decisions? Because obviously things are moving rapidly.
Yeah, there's discussions already going on to work frameworks for it, but as I mentioned, at the end of the day, it's going to really be dependent on the characteristic of the particular vaccine product that we're now planning to do.
Staying with you, Dr. Redfield, last month the Agency for Toxic Substances and Disease Registry issued a statement expressing concerns about the relationship between exposure to PFAS chemicals and the risk for COVID-19 infections and complications. In New Hampshire and in communities across this country, we have a number of people who have been exposed to PFAS who are very concerned about this statement. So can you tell us what the agency is doing, what CDC is doing to assess the impact of PFAS exposure on COVID-19 risks?
Yeah, we're currently working, both of our Agency for Toxic Substances and our Flu Division are working together in a study to try to learn better about the interrelationship between the PFAS serum concentrations, for example, and the association between symptomatic or asymptomatic COVID infection, severity of symptoms, and hospitalization. So we do have a study ongoing to try to understand that association, Senator.
And do you have any timeline, again, for that study, when you expect to have data that could give us some insights on that?
I think I've really learned that I have to be careful in trying to predict. You know, as my colleague, Dr. Collins said, science has its own timeline.
But do you think we're talking months, years, decades?
We're not talking decades, okay? But obviously we're trying to get that information as soon as we can. And I really am not able to commit how fast the science will be done, Senator.
Well, it seems to me that would speak to trying to address PFAS exposure wherever we can. I think this is for you, Dr. Disbrow. As we're talking about the challenge in this pandemic, one of those, in testing at least, has been trying to provide access to all of the ancillary supplies that are required. I think that is probably going to also be true as we think about the vaccination plan and distribution. We've heard from one manufacturer in New Hampshire who makes syringes that they need some certainty so they can order the equipment they're going to need to make those syringes that are going to be available for vaccinations. So can you give us any details on the anticipated timeline for the award of contracts for production and supplies?
Sure. Thank you for that question. So as everybody knows, making a vaccine is more than just making the bulk vaccine. There are multiple steps involved. You have to have fill-finish capacity. So BARDA is working very hard with our partners, the Joint Program Executive Office, CBRND at DOD, as well as under OWS, to reserve excess capacity for fill-finish so that you can not only make the vaccine, but you can fill it. We're working with JPEO to expand capacity for vials because you need the vials to put the vaccine in. We have awarded contracts for needles and syringes, acquiring needles and syringes. We're also working with JPEO to expand capacity for needles and syringes so that there are sufficient needles and syringes when the vaccine becomes available. So we're working on all aspects of the vaccine. There's also kitting. When you send out a vaccine, you have to have, the needles and syringes, alcohol wipes, Band-Aids, all of that. And then there's the distribution. And as Dr. Redfield mentioned earlier, it is very important that the people who are developing the vaccine, and under Warp Speed we are tied in with the group that is talking about distribution and kitting, because they have to know what that vaccine is going to look like. Is it a single-dose vial, a multi-dose vial? What is the cold chain requirement? So we are working across Operation Warp Speed in multiple different work streams that are fully integrated.
Thank you, Senator. Senator Moran.
Chairman, thank you. Thanks to you and the ranking member for having this hearing. Gentlemen, thank you for joining us. Dr. Collins, let me first thank you for joining me on a phone call with the University of Kansas Health System, in which your report on a vaccine was the highlight of the day, month, and year. So I'm pleased to hear that medical researchers and practitioners in Kansas heard what you said and found it to be a very pleasing, kind of an optimistic note. Let me ask something that is COVID-19 or is a virus so unique that there are not things that can be done to better prepare us for the next virus, the next pandemic, so that a vaccine development is developed, the development occurs in a shorter period of time? Or is it just starting, I don't know that scratch is the right word, but starting from scratch each time?
It's a great question, Senator. And yes, I enjoyed talking to the folks in Kansas, a wonderful bunch of scientists and physicians. Coronaviruses, of which this is one, have been around a long time. Some of them caused the common cold, and we still haven't cured that one, but it hasn't been such a high priority. And SARS and MERS were also coronaviruses. We learned something from them. If we'd not had already an effort to try to develop vaccines for SARS and MERS, we wouldn't have been able to jump on SARS-CoV-2, this guy, quite as quickly. So every time you do this, you get a little better at it. And plus, the overall technology for how we develop vaccines has been advancing. The lead vaccine now, in terms of its earliest out of the gate, which is the Moderna vaccine, and also the Pfizer one that was announced yesterday, same principle, utilizing RNA as the thing that you actually inject so that you ask the body to make the protein, which then becomes the antigen that your immune system reacts to. That's pretty new. We would not have done that 10 years ago. We wouldn't have known how. And we'll keep getting better at new ideas at that. I do hope, and maybe this is part of your question, that we learn from this experience that when we get through this, because we're going to get through this, we don't then go back into some complacency and say, well, that's it. We won't ever have another one like that again, because we all know we will. And what will it be? Will it be another coronavirus? Will it be that influenza epidemic that we've been worried we're overdue for, coming out of somewhere that's actually going to be very dangerous? We should never again step back into the point of complacency with these kinds of emerging infections. And I hope we will therefore, from what has been built to deal with COVID-19, sustain that.
Dr. Collins, thank you. I want to follow up on that, but I want to make sure I get a question to Dr. Redfield, and I'll try to be back to Dr. Collins. Dr. Redfield, thank you for the telephone conversation we had several months ago. I would highlight for you and others who might be listening that the issue of PPE, personal protection equipment, is back front and center. It seemed to me in my life it had diminished a bit, but in a conversation with community leaders, including hospital and public health officials, the concern is the supply is short once again as the numbers increase and the potential of a greater circumstance, a more challenging circumstance comes in this fall. So any suggestions that anyone who hears this statement of mine has on how I can get additional PPE to Kansas public health hospitals and employers, I would welcome that. But let me ask you, one of the things I take away from what's transpired is the importance of the public health departments. And I think generally we have, until I served on this committee, I didn't realize the significant role that CDC plays in support of our community and public health departments. What is it that needs to take place so that when the vaccine is developed, our public health departments are prepared to administer that vaccine in the distribution? How can CDC, how can this committee help make certain that occurs well?
Thank you very much, Senator. I think you've heard me say before, we've had decades of underinvestment in our public health departments across this nation, and this is the time now to correct that. And you all have really made great support. CDC has already awarded $12 billion with a B to the local, state, territorial, tribal health departments in the last 8 weeks or so to begin to give them the resources they need to begin to build up their capacity. The human capacity usually takes longer than weeks to build up. We're obviously, as you know, I said CDC has over 650 people now embedded in the local health departments to help with that human capacity. And we're going to continue to work with them. Recently, with the resources you did with the CARES Act, we were able to get a little over $10 billion out for each of the jurisdictions to put up plans to how to expand their testing, their contact tracing, their isolation, their public health infrastructure. So we're doing it on the run. I think you've heard me say before, when it comes to public health, this is something we as a nation should plan to be over-prepared, not under-prepared. And I do believe this is the moment in time when this nation can actually help put the public health infrastructure across this nation, not only that we need, but this nation deserves. As you mentioned, most of CDC's money actually get distributed to the local, state, territorial, tribal health departments, and some of these health departments were 70% of their overall funding. So we are the nation's funder, through you, of the public health infrastructure of this nation, and we need to augment that to where we're now over-prepared for the next pandemic.
Mr. Chairman, if you have a second round, I'll try to follow up with Dr. Collins.
Thank you, Senator Moran. Senator Merkley.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. And Dr. Collins, I wanted to get some sense from you of our understanding in a short and simple version of whether this coronavirus is such that we anticipate that its mutations will mean that different vaccines may be effective against some versions of the disease, but not others, and whether it means we will likely have to have an annual production of modified vaccines based on those mutations like we have with the flu.
Senator, thank you. That's a very important scientific question that many of us are wrestling with, trying to collect as much data as we can. I think the somewhat reassuring news is that this particular virus, which is an RNA virus, does not have a rapid mutation rate. It's not like influenza or HIV, where you know you're going to have a really tough time getting a vaccine to work or to stay effective. But it does change over time. There is at least one significant variant in the virus that's already happened since it's originally appeared about 6 months ago that may have made it somewhat more infectious than the original strain coming out of Wuhan. We're not absolutely sure of that, but it looks like that might be the case. The good news is that those variants that we've detected do not seem to be those that would interfere with the effectiveness of the current vaccines that are being designed and tested, nor with the monoclonal antibody strategies that are also being tempted. But we're going to watch that very carefully. And a big question we will all have is whether this is a circumstance where once vaccinated, you are basically protected for life, or whether over the course of time, this virus will change its coat enough that you will need to have a booster that's slightly better in its design for whatever it is that this turns into next. We don't know the answer to that. But I think the good news is this is not like HIV, this is not like influenza. It's a fairly well-behaved virus that we think we ought to be able to tackle effectively with a vaccine strategy.
Thank you very much, Doctor. And I want to turn to the question that Senator Murray raised about the elimination of the buy-dole safeguards. Those safeguards for reasonable pricing when the government has invested in the development have never been implemented, but many people feel they serve as an effective instrument of leverage should the American people be gouged after investing millions or now perhaps billions of dollars. Was NIH consulted about removing the buy-dole safeguards from the contracts?
We were not asked about that. We've been asked about those safeguards in other circumstances.
Do you support inclusion of those safeguards to protect the American people from price gouging after we invest in the development of drugs?
I certainly think the American people ought to have access to vaccines that they're helping to pay for, and I think the plan has been nicely made to be sure that that is the case so that nobody would be denied access to this regardless of their health care coverage. The march-in rights issue actually are rather complicated. When you look at the original language of buy-dole, it does seem, as Dr. Disbrow said earlier, that these were intended to try to allow the government to step in when there was a company that basically refused to try to produce a product that would benefit the public. It does not look as if those particular parts of the bill were intended to do something where the price was considered to be unacceptable. We've been caught in this many times before, and that's what the lawyers tell me. So in this circumstance, I have to defer to BARDA in terms of why the decision was made, but my understanding was there was really no likelihood that the product wasn't going to be pursued, in which case march-in rights would be a tough thing to try to apply.
In which case it'd be okay to leave them in the contract. Moderna contract still has those march-in rights, and NIH claims joint ownership of the Moderna vaccine. So I find it interesting that NIH wasn't consulted over the difference between that contract and some of these other contracts.
I have to be careful here because it's possible somebody at NIH was consulted, but I was not made aware of it. So I'll have to check on that and see if there was a consultation.
Yeah, thank you. And Dr. Redfield, was the CDC consulted over the elimination of this contract language in designed to ensure fair pricing?
Not to my knowledge, sir.
Okay, thank you. And Dr. Disbrow, why suddenly eliminate this language in some of these contracts but not others? Who was it who asked you to do this, and why did you include the language in some contracts and not others?
So I think some of the confusion is that in our FAR-based contracts, it is in there. Some of the documents that were requested by the group that asked for them under FOIA, Freedom of Information Act, were other transactional agreements, which are outside of the FAR. And also to remember that these are research and development contracts. We are not acquiring product under these contracts.
Well, recognize, too, that it's research and development being funded by the American people with a vast potential for profit for the companies. So the American people have a stake in fair pricing. I think the American people are aware that they are gouged on drugs routinely, that we pay more than citizens in any other developed country. 80% of Americans routinely respond they want fair pricing, that they shouldn't be charged more than the citizens of other countries, especially because we spend more in the development of the products. And I think that plays double here. The reason I'm emphasizing this is we're going to spend billions of dollars in this development, and we should absolutely use that investment to make sure that we're not gouged on the back end. And so I just want to say that this conversation that Murray initiated and I'm following up on here is an important one, and I hope you're going to take full and thoughtful consideration of how to make sure that Americans do not pay more for these drugs through the government payments or through citizens having to pay for them than do the citizens of any other developed country. In fact, I hope you'll pledge to make sure that that's the case.
Thank you, Senator Merkley. If you want to come back for a second round, you can. Senator Capito.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you all for not just being here today. I know you've been on Capitol Hill many times, but thank you for what you've done and what you're going to do to meet this crisis. Dr. Disbrow, I have a question. Many of my questions that I had initially have sort of you all have answered on the safety and efficacy issues around a vaccine. But as I recall back when we first started, we had an issue with China making the PPE, with Italy having the swabs. I might have this a little wrong, but the reagents in Germany, and there was a competition globally for all of these supplies. I imagine that there's going to be a competition globally for the vaccine supplies and the vaccine itself. Dr. Collins mentioned that they have been working with the UK in a collaborative way. But how much of what you're seeing the development is actually manufactured in this country where we can sort of control our own destiny?
Sure. Thank you for the question, and it's a very important question. This global pandemic has highlighted the vulnerability in our supply chains for medical devices, raw materials, and active pharmaceutical ingredients for drugs. I can't give you the specific number of what percent of the products are manufactured here in the United States, but what we are doing, as I mentioned, responded to one of the earlier questions, is we are working for needles and syringes and vials to expand domestic capacity so that we don't have to worry about this in the future, immediate future or in the near future. We are also working with all of our manufacturers to make sure they acquire the raw materials that are needed to manufacture vaccines and or therapeutics, because don't forget therapeutics are also important, so that they can manufacture at scale.
Is this a question that you ask when you're looking at giving contracts, whether it's produced in the United States where you can control your own destiny?
So we look at their raw supply material chain. We do that for all of our manufacturers to identify risk early on and try to address those risks very early on.
Well, I'd like to dig down on that because I think, I think that's concerning, I think, obviously because this is a global issue, but also I think it sort of shook the American public when we realized we weren't really controlling the ability to have testing supplies or the ability to produce our own PPE. Dr. Collins, a question I have is a little off topic, but equally as important. You know that NIH has invested heavily, and so have we here on the opioid epidemic. But the latest stats coming out of our state of West Virginia, Senator Manchin's here, and across the country is that there has been a big spike in overdoses during this COVID and epidemic. And I'm wondering, I know you're fast at work on this in a lot of different various ways, but how are you seeing that, and how might having a vaccine or having better therapeutics be able to help us meet this challenge of folks that are in therapy for addiction or have this addiction issue to be able to cope during these very stressful times?
Senator, I really appreciate your bringing this up, and it's not off topic at all. It's a really serious national tragedy that has now gotten even worse because of the coalescence of the COVID-19 crisis and the opioid use disorder crisis. And I've seen those same statistics about maybe a 42% increase in overdoses in just the last 3 months, and deaths associated with that are going up. After we had started to make some headway with this crisis, with all of the things that had been done with various programs and use of medications that we know can work, and yet now prescriptions for those medications have plummeted because people aren't able to get into treatment programs. We are doing everything we can at NIH with supplements to some of our research programs to try to understand how best to intervene, how to provide people with support, even if it has to be done remotely by telemedicine kinds of interventions. We've been supporting the idea that methadone, which traditionally required people to show up every day in a crowded location, could actually be done in a fashion where people could receive this at home, because otherwise the dangers are too great and people were simply dropping out. But I can't tell you how desperately we need to get back in a place where people can congregate together. And that will require, of course, effective treatments and vaccines, and that's on my mind every day as we're trying to accelerate that progress. This is a very serious situation indeed.
It is, and anecdotally, I heard that really the counseling that was going on by telehealth initially was actually having greater, they were staying more true to their appointments, and it was going well, and then it just has gone back down.
People need interaction more than just through a Zoom call, and that's hard to do right now.
All right. Dr. Redfield, I have 4 seconds. Our vaccination rate in West Virginia is falling. How are we going to do a PR campaign to say the vaccination for this is important and other vaccinations?
Yeah, it's a critical point, Senator. And I always look at the consequences of COVID, as the Secretary said, health versus health. 85% decline in pediatric vaccinations for individuals under 5. We're obviously we're in the process of making a play with the American Academy of Pediatrics and throughout to really respond to that. It's really, really important. Globally, it's a big issue too. I've tried to say in sub-Saharan Africa, whereas COVID's now a significant problem, but a much bigger problem is there's 120 million children now who haven't gotten measles vaccine.
Right.
And measles is going to have significant mortality in Africa.
Thank you.
Thank you, Senator. Senator Baldwin.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I have a couple of, I hope, quick questions. Dr. Disbrow, can you just quickly list for me the vaccine prospects that are being invested in right now? You know, you've narrowed it from many who have come forward to, I think it was first 14 and now fewer. Can you just list those for me and what type of vaccine it is?
So I appreciate the question, Senator. I cannot specifically mention some of the companies. We're in active negotiations with many of them. One that I can mention is AstraZeneca, where we already have a very large contract that covers both advanced research and development and procurement. We are in the process of moving forward with large manufacturing contracts and acquisition of the vaccine for multiple other candidates.
So those company names in terms of the vaccine prospects are not public?
So some of the companies that were originally funded by BARDA for advanced research and development, those are public, who we've invested in. I think your specific question may be the composition of the portfolio under Operation Warp Speed. That I cannot today talk about, but we are very quickly moving and negotiating contracts, and hopefully in the very near future we will be able to make an announcement with the entire portfolio under Operation Warp Speed.
How many have been finalized right now versus how many are you still in negotiations with?
So I already told you about the one, which is the AstraZeneca, and we have multiple other candidates that we're working with.
And how many do you think you'll have in total?
More than one. Sorry, it really is procurement sensitive. These are market moving negotiations that we're having with these companies. So I just need to be very careful about that. But again, we are happy to publicly announce. You will see the press releases when we award these contracts so that everybody is aware of what's being supported.
So you have the intellectual property of Prospect. You also have the manufacturing. You want to make sure to fit timelines that you'll be able to have
Senator. We have had interactions with most of the sports industries, both at the professional, collegial level.
But why not? Why not? That's a really important question. Should we put 20,000 people in a college football stadium? Why haven't you released that guidance?
I guess I misspoke then. I thought if you thought we directly recommended that we have fans. We have put out our guidance several weeks ago on mass gatherings, which would include obviously those events. And we have obviously commented directly in our guidance over the last 3 or 4 months on gathering size and precluded fans from going to being recommended in these sporting events. I was looking at the other way around. Did you think we made a positive recommendation to include them? So clearly in our mass guidance and clearly in all of our previous guidance to slow the spread and for the 15 and then 30 days, we've not recommended these gatherings to be such that you would have fans in the stands.
Thank you, Senator Murphy. Senator Manchin.
Thank you all for being here. It's good to hear from you. I'm just trying to, Dr. Desbrow, just a simple explanation of the money that we've invested so far. And I know there's, my tally shows Johnson & Johnson got $456 million. Moderna's got $483. AstraZeneca was $1.2 billion. Emergent Biosolutions, $628. That was all for developing vaccines. That comes out to about $2.76 billion. And then for distribution and manufacturing, Apogec got $138, Corning $204, Valor Glass $164, SiO2 Materials Science $143, for a total about $650 million. So when you put it all together, you're up at around 3/4 in that neighborhood so far. What do we get back as taxpayers when this vaccine, when one of these companies or all these companies have a proven vaccine? Are we like a private investor from the federal government? Do we get something in return? Do we get this value back as far as in the vaccine that can be distributed to all of our health centers, or now we have to buy it back?
So there will be future procurements of the vaccine, but to address your specific point, yes, we do receive. So when we are doing contracting for acquisition, we seek consideration to the U.S. government for our previous investment. And it's more than just a dollar per dollar investment. It is also the cost of capital because the U.S. government took the risk to make that investment.
Right. I mean, we're taking the risk the same as the private sector would take the risk, right?
Correct.
So a private citizen would take this type of risk. They get a bigger return for the risk.
Right. So our investments would be taken off the
our investments are par to what the private would make as far as the return back?
No. So if the company was going to charge $10 for a dose of vaccine, this is just an arbitrary number. I'm not saying anybody's charging $10 a dose for, sale outside the United States. In the United States, the U.S. government would buy it at a reduced price because we've already invested $450 million, to support the research and development.
So basically, we're going to get our value back.
Correct.
Okay. And are we able to control any of the pricing on this too, or be able to put pressure on them not to gouge?
So again, whenever we're negotiating, we always negotiate best value to the U.S. government. We seek consideration. I mean, these are hard negotiations that we have, but yes, we seek best value to the U.S. government.
Well, and I know you've already touched on basically how we're going to get out. The PPEs didn't get out the way they were supposed to get out, as far as we still have people problems there, and we're concerned about getting distribution. And I know you all spoke about the community health centers, Dr. Collins and all that, and I appreciate what you all have done there, but I can tell you they're still hurting very much so, because a lot of the states have not distributed the money that they received as help from the CARES package to keep them viable. And there's money there that hasn't been distributed properly, and we all should be putting pressure on our governors to do their job to make sure our first responders and our county health departments have the necessary funds. And they're not getting it, I can assure you. Rural health. Rural providers have been hit particularly hard by epidemic across the United States. COVID-19 are growing faster in rural areas at 13% than the national rate of 9% for the second week in a row. Rural counties have had the highest number of new cases of COVID-19 in a 7-day period since the pandemic began. West Virginia saw its single-day high just yesterday. So we have 12 hospitals, and all of our hospitals are rural. 12 hospitals already closed, 3 in West Virginia, and we're concerned about the rural health care that we have to distribute. How's the vaccine going to be distributed in the rural areas to make sure that we're able to meet the rising challenges that we have there? Rural providers have the necessary equipment, or they have the personnel to administer the vaccine.
Thank you, Senator. A really, really important question, as you know, and the broader question of how we maintain health capacity in rural America. As I said, there's going to need to be a variety of innovative strategies to ensure that we can get broad distribution, particularly the groups that have been under-vaccinated. You mentioned the rural. We've also had under-vaccination historically in African American, Hispanic populations. And, you know, we need to more aggressively, in the H1N1, there was reluctance to fully engage the pharmacies and those opportunities as vaccine outlets. Clearly, we need to expand that in this distribution. There is going to need to be clear interlinkage, as you mentioned, with the community health centers that are there and augment them to be part of it along with the local health departments. But in addition to that, I think there's going to need to be mobile units that are going to be able to go and provide broader vaccination access, particularly in rural America.
Let me just say, my time is up. Rural America basically is getting hit hard now. We knew it would be a delayed reaction of how they're getting hit. But we have the most vulnerable population in the country in West Virginia because of our age and the type of hard work that they've done. So they have underlying health conditions too. And if it hits, it's going to be of disastrous proportions. So we need to stay ahead of that. And right now we had a hard time getting everything else. If we have a hard time getting a vaccine or an antibody when it comes, we're really up the creek. So we hope that you put the attention towards rural and make sure that your associates understand the need for rural.
We're committed to make sure that all those in need get access to this vaccine.
Okay. Thank you, sir.
Thank you, Senator Manchin. Dr. Despro, let's talk a little more about any obligation these companies we've partnered with have to be sure that the vaccine is available at a reasonable price. If they fail, we underwrite their failure. I'm for that. I want to get plenty of opportunities out there on the field advancing forward so that we have as many vaccines as we can have available, as soon as many of the individual vaccines available as soon as we can. But if we're successful, we basically get our money back plus interest. Surely there are other obligations here in that partnership of the private partner.
Correct.
To make the vaccine available in a reasonable way. Would you expand on that a little bit?
Sure, and thanks for the question, Senator. So also remember that, you know, each of the companies that we're working with, it's a true partnership. The U.S. government has assumed risk. Many of the contracts that we have are cost share contracts, meaning that the company also assumes risk. The companies, while we're working on, awarding the contracts that I mentioned earlier, are agreeing to proceed at risk under Operation Warp Speed because, they are committed to developing a vaccine. But yes, the goal is to negotiate the best price for the U.S. government. We would probably have to pay a slightly higher price for industry partners who chose not to receive government funding because they assumed 100% of the risk.
All right. Dr. Collins, so what's going on, and others can enter into this discussion if you want to, but in terms of determining the health priorities, or we should be doing this right now. We know we're eventually going to have a vaccine. We know therapeutics. Let's focus on where we're going to be with the vaccine in terms of distribution and accessibility. Who's talking about health priorities or ethical issues that relate to the rapid opportunity for people who want a vaccine to get a chance to have the vaccination?
So it's a very important question, and one that is occupying the minds of a lot of us thinking about this future that we hope to have as soon as possible. You've heard Bob Redfield talking quite a bit about what CDC's role is, which is absolutely central in terms of this distribution effort. But I think there may also be an opportunity before we get to that moment where we actually have a vaccine that has been proven safe and effective, to have a broader discussion that brings into this ethics, experts in public health, people who are particularly aware of the challenges for reaching out to those who've suffered from health disparities for a long time and are being hit particularly hard by COVID-19 is another area where we want to be sure, as far as priorities, that is considered in a big way. Bob Redfield and I have talked a bit about this. This may be a moment to actually bring together a group of such big thinkers who could take a high-level view of this and lay out a foundation of principles that then could be utilized by his CDC committee, the ACIP, when the moment comes to actually turn that into an implementation plan. And we think that that might be something best done in a circumstance by an organization that is not itself governmental, because it's still the case, I think, that people are a little uneasy about the government calling the shots here. And so we are having a conversation very early on with the National Academy of Medicine about whether they would be the place to convene such a discussion. We can keep you posted on that. It looks pretty promising. I personally think that would be a really good step right now, and to do that quickly and have those principles laid out, say, before Labor Day.
I'm confident we'll hear from others about whether the National Academy of Medicine is the best place to do this or not, and that's good. That input will be good, and we'll share it with you as we hear it, and you may hear it even before we do. But it does seem to me that this should be happening right now. Just like every other plan about distribution of the vaccine, of therapeutics, of testing, but particularly the vaccine, I would think if we're going to have this discussion, let's not have it after we have a vaccine and we're waiting to distribute it because we haven't had a discussion of the ethics or healthcare priorities. Dr. Redfield, do you want to talk about this?
I just wanted to make one comment, Mr. Chairman, because I couldn't agree with you more. But I do also want to say how important it is that we have it now, because it's not just about who's going to get the vaccine. It's also about we have a requirement to study the safety and efficacy of the vaccine in these populations. Historically, if you have underlying medical conditions significant, you don't get into vaccine trials. If you have pregnancy, you don't get in vaccine trials. If you're a child, you don't get in vaccine trials. And I know Dr. Collins and I have discussed this, and I know they're planning to make sure these populations are included, because the last thing we want to be is trying to recommend who gets the vaccine and we don't have any data in how the vaccine works in the population that we really think this vaccine needs. So clearly right now, there's really thoughtful thinking among the vaccine trialists. How do we make sure that we have good representation of African Americans, Hispanics, children, pregnancy women, individuals that are elderly, that have multiple chronic medical conditions, because that's where this vaccine needs to go. And so I don't know if Francis wants to comment any more on it, but I know that they are thinking how to move those populations into the phase 3 trial efforts so that we'll have that data when we need it.
Dr. Collins, and then we'll go to Senator Murray.
Well, Dr. Redfield has said it well. This has got to be a really high priority. This may make it more challenging to run a phase 3 vaccine trial when you're trying to enroll a very diverse set of volunteers. It would be much easier just to line up a whole bunch of 20-somethings who happen to be from the white population. But that is not the only answer we need. We need to really have this diversity, and many of us are working hard to make sure that as those trials get launched in the very near future, that they have that kind of outreach.
Yeah, well, let's be sure that the trials aren't needlessly waiting because we haven't had this discussion as quickly as we need to have it. Senator Murray.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And that's exactly why I've been talking about why we need a plan and why we need to see that plan. And specifically, the public needs to see this plan, because even if everything goes well and we have a vaccine and it is safe and effective and to the best of everybody's knowledge, it isn't going to be available for everybody September 1st. And we need to know how it's going to be distributed, where it's going to go, what the priorities are. Public is good at dealing with facts. They're not good at dealing with very high expectations that have no chance of being met. And then we run into all kinds of problems. So that's why I have been pushing for a public plan, for us to see it, and for us to be able to know how this is going to happen. So I'm in that game. Dr. Disbrow, let me ask you, experts are saying that clinical trials for treatments can move more quickly than vaccine trials, and that an effective drug that renders the virus less deadly could allow us to begin to return to normal faster. So I was concerned last month that BARDA abruptly notified researchers that it was halting funding for treatments for severe lung ailments that were associated with the virus, as well as treatments that dampen the overactive immune response that causes the body to actually turn on itself. I wanted to ask you, why did BARDA decide that the development of therapeutics for severe forms of COVID-19 is not a priority, and how did it communicate that change?
Right, so thank you for the question, Senator. Two-part response, and I promise to be very quick. So BARDA continues to invest heavily in therapeutics. We are investing in a collection of convalescent plasma, supporting the very large expanded access protocol that you heard about before. Over 25,000 people have been transfused. We're further supporting hyperimmune globulin, which is where you take pooled plasma and further process that to concentrate the antibodies. And we're also supporting neutralizing monoclonal antibodies. All of that is being done under Operation Warp Speed, similar to what we're doing for vaccines. We did close the immunotherapeutics portion of our broad agency announcement because at the same time, under Operation Warp Speed, in collaboration with Dr. Collins' active program, what we were receiving were individual proposals with no clear identification that the products would work as an immune modulator, but requesting very large phase 2-3 studies. So under the active partnership and with OWS, the decision was made to stand up large clinical trials, a clinical network under a master protocol where you can evaluate multiple candidates for immune modulators, and they will also be looking at anticoagulants as well in a smaller cohort to determine if there's clinical benefit. If any of these drugs that are run through the active protocols show clinical benefit, we are happy to engage with those developers to help them with manufacturing.
So it was also reported that BARDA is suspending applications for the development of preventive treatments for COVID-19. Can you explain that?
I'm sorry, I didn't hear the question, the last part.
It was reported recently that BARDA is suspending applications for the development of preventive treatments for COVID-19. Explain that.
So preventive therapeutic treatments?
Correct.
So I will have to look into that and get back to you. I apologize.
Okay, well, vaccines are important. We all want that, but I think that we can't put all of our eggs in one basket, especially since we know there's no effective vaccine yet, and we've seen issues in the past where it's hard to develop. We all want it, but we can't put all of our eggs in one basket. So I am concerned, and I will be following that. Dr. Collins, I want to direct a question to you. Given the devastating impacts of COVID-19 on Black, Latino, tribal communities, it's so important that we ensure equitable representation in our clinical trials for vaccines and therapeutics. There was an internal analysis on inclusion that showed that only 29% of participants in NIH-funded clinical research were members of racial minority groups, only 9% were ethnic minorities, and initial reports suggest we're still not achieving adequate enrollment for these groups in clinical trials for potential COVID-19 treatments and vaccines. Can you tell us what NIH is doing to reduce the barriers for participation and recruit people for these?
Senator, I really appreciate this question. This is an extremely high priority. As has already been pointed out at this hearing, the burden that has been laid upon the shoulders of minority groups, particularly African Americans, Latinos, and Native Americans from COVID-19 has been extreme, with much higher rates of hospitalization and death in those groups. And that means that the health disparities that we have known been around for a long time have a very bright light now being shown on them. And this is our opportunity and our responsibility to take this on with the greatest seriousness. Certainly when it comes to running the clinical trials, both for vaccines and for therapeutics, this will be the highest priority. We want to work with the parts of NIH that have expertise in this space, like the National Institute of Minority Health and Health Disparities. But we also want to work with the institutions out there, like the HBCUs, that have that kind of credibility and capability. there's an irony here in that we're also at a moment, I think, where there is perhaps more suspicion about government involvement in such things, and yet this is the very moment where we need to have the trust of those communities to reach out to them, and that means we need to engage community leaders in that space. That means the churches, that means the heads of various organizations that represent these underserved populations, and we are building all those bridges as fast as we can. And I totally agree with you. If we fail at this moment where health disparities have emerged in such a dramatic way, we will have really failed to live up to our responsibility as stewards of the public trust.
Mr. Chairman, let me just ask one quick follow-up on that, because there was a recent report from CDC that pregnant women are more likely to be hospitalized with COVID-19 than non-pregnant women. And despite a lack of data, it's clear women of color are disproportionately at risk. So I'm really concerned about the lack of inclusion of pregnant and lactate women in COVID-19 clinical trials. Are you going to follow the FDA guidance by including pregnant and lactating women in clinical trials for the COVID-19?
Absolutely. And you may know we've had this committee, the PregLac committee, that has been looking at ways that we could have more inclusion of pregnant women and lactating women, and it applies very strongly in this place. This is another high priority at NIH. Dr. Diana Bianchi, who is our Institute Director for Child Health and Human Development, has been a leader in this space. We're trying to put together some additional research efforts to try to improve the ability to do successful outreach safely to pregnant women and lactating women. We have to have that included as part of this mission.
Thank you. And thank you for indulging me, Mr. Chairman. Thank you.
Thank you, Senator Murray. Senator Alexander.
Thanks, Mr. Chairman. Dr. Collins, I believe you said that you're considering involving the National Academy of Medicine in determining the fairness of the distribution of vaccines. Is that correct?
That is correct.
The National Academies describes itself this way. If I remember, it was founded by President Lincoln, chartered by the United States Congress to attempt authoritative, objective, and scientifically based answers to difficult questions of national importance. The New York Times called the National Academy of Medicine the United States' most esteemed and authoritative advisor on issues of health and medicine. So put me down as thinking that's a good idea to involve, because as people across the country look up at what's happening here, they'll see agencies with alphabetical names, and they may be greatly respected agencies or bodies, but I don't believe they have the prestige of the National Academy of Medicine. So in terms of the fairness of the distribution, I think the only downside I can think of, because I've worked with the academies many times, you may have to speed them up a little bit, because academies are accustomed to not moving at warp speed, and you're trying to move at warp speed. But we're not talking about safety, we're talking about fairness. I think that's a good idea, and I would endorse it. Now let me move on to something else, Dr. Collins. I want to pick up words that either you or Senator Moran said, something like sustaining what we've built. We had a whole hearing about this in our committee that Senator Murray and I chair, the Health Committee. For 20 years, we've had 4 presidents and several Congresses pass 9 laws and try to be prepared for pandemics, and we thought we were, and then we get assaulted with this sneaky, dangerous COVID-19 virus, and we find gaps that didn't happen. Senator Frist, the former majority leader, testified before our committee. He pointed out that he made 20 speeches when he was the majority leader, identifying exactly what needed to be done, tried to do them, but in between pandemics, we get our eye off the ball. We have other things to do, and we don't do the hard things. So it seems to me that what I'm going to work hard with Senator Blunt, Senator Murray, anyone else, Senator Shelby, others, to try to make sure that we don't make that mistake this time, and that while we've got our eye on the ball, while we're paying attention, while we have these lessons in front of us, that we deal with them. For example, manufacturing. We're building up capacity. We're building up onshore capacity, BARDA says. Well, are we going to sustain that? Or are we just going to let happen to it what Governor Leavitt testified happened with the last manufacturing plant? Stockpiles. We know what happened with the stockpiles. They diminished. Hospitals and states sold them off. They didn't have the money to keep them up. data. We're not all happy with the way data is being aggregated by CDC and need to take a look at that. Are we going to wait until next year when we're worrying about something else? Are we going to do it now? Hospital preparedness. We're getting our hospitals prepared again, but are we going to sustain that for the next pandemic? This is not the last sneaky, dangerous virus that's going to assault our people. State and local support for public health. Governor Leavitt, the former Secretary of Health, former governor, said that for 30 or 40 years, as Dr. Redfield has said, we've gradually underfunded public health. So we're not as prepared as we think we are when we're assaulted by a virus like this. So I would like, in my remaining moments, Dr. Collins, to have your comment on the importance of, in the middle of this pandemic, sustaining what we've built up for the next pandemic, because I'm pretty sure, based on my experience, that if we wait 6 months and everything is over and we're back to normal, we'll be worrying about something else, and we won't make the difficult funding decisions, which most of them are, on manufacturing stockpiles, data, hospital preparedness, and state and local public health.
Well, I'd love to capture the words you've just spoken and try to be sure that we all look at those every month or so after we get through this current crisis, which we will. But our track record's not so good here. We don't really think about this as sort of we need an insurance policy against the next pandemic. We would never think about going bare in terms of insurance for our homes or our cars, but we've gone bare too often in terms of insurance against pandemics, which requires that sustained investment. You've enumerated quite nicely the areas that have been allowed to slip in between these episodes. We might have a COVID-23. Who knows what the next coronavirus is? Or we might have an influenza that comes, which is sort of overdue now. And my sincere hope would be, given that this has been, after all, the most serious infectious threat in the lifetime of any of us, that this time we would have a little sustained memory. And I, for one, would very much like to help with that, too.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Senator Alexander. Senator Moran.
Mr. Chairman, thank you very much. And I have been listening in my office to all of the hearing today, but I'm glad I was here in person to hear what Senator Alexander just said. And Lamar, while your tenure in the United States Senate is coming to an end, I hope your voice on this and many other things does not cease.
Thank you.
What you just said is important for us and for the American people to hear, and I appreciate how you've conducted yourself always, but what you had to say today was especially valuable. Dr. Collins, I promised I'd come back to ask you a question, and it deals with the consequences of the pandemic on research that was ongoing pre-pandemic. And so I'm worried, this subcommittee, this appropriations committee, NIH, our colleagues in Congress have highlighted the importance of NIH research and in many instances have put our money where our mouths are. And I'm worried that we have set the stage for a step backwards rather than a step forward as a result of the virus. And so my question is, you can discount that if that's true, if that's not true, but my impression is that research that should be ongoing today is not, that laboratories are not at capacity, many are shut down, people have not been able to come to work. I don't know how prevalent that is in university research versus institutions in Maryland, but what is it that we need to know to make certain that we provide the resources, perhaps in a phase 4, that would quickly restart the capabilities of NIH to be on the path toward finding the cures to all the things we want to cure?
Senator, I really appreciate your asking the question. This is very much on my mind as I see the way in which, by necessity, for safety reasons, so much of our research enterprise, not just at NIH and our laboratories in Bethesda, but all over the country, since that's where most of NIH's dollars go, has been very much scaled back. Any research that involved something other than COVID-19 was pretty much put into a very slow pace because people needed to head home to protect against the further outbreaks. And people were still able to do science, and many of them have worked incredibly hard doing what they can do. But if you need a lab bench and you need some equipment and some supplies, you can't do that in your dining room. So it is fair to say we have lost a lot of time with research that required that kind of action, whether it's in cancer research or has something to do with gene therapy or a diabetes project like in my lab, because all of my people had to go home too. This has been a major negative consequence, among many others, of COVID-19. We do not want to see that have a lasting impact. I will tell you the universities who are our major grantees are hurting bad right now because of the way in which this has hit them financially. They've both had the difficulty of not being able to conduct research that they thought they were doing, but of course many of them have medical centers that have been hemorrhaging money because of the inability to do elective surgeries and other procedures that would normally allow them to balance the books. They're in deep trouble. We have estimated just on the basis of the research that's been lost, something in the neighborhood of $10 billion of federal funds that may be necessary to recoup if we're going to bring these institutions back up to where they need to be. On top of that, I think there's a wide variety of areas that NIH... my watch is talking to me, thinking I'm talking too long. A wide variety of areas that NIH really would like to also put more efforts into to compensate for this in terms of our efforts in COVID-19. So yes, we have been very interested in hearing what might be possible in terms of that compensation, and I know the institutions who are our grantees are particularly so, probably including in Kansas. I would be surprised if you've not heard from the leaders there about the situation they're in.
Doctor, thank you. I don't know how many times I've asked you, when are we going to be able to delay the onset? When is the research going to be sufficient to delay the onset of Alzheimer's? When are we going to be able to rid ourselves of diabetes? And you have, in your ways, have tried to tell us the time frame on which things seem to be on. And I worry that if we ask the question today, it would have to be a time frame that is much shorter. And while the pandemic is certainly severe and serious, a crisis in many ways, the cure for cancer, the ridding ourselves of diabetes and Alzheimer's is so significant as well that we cannot now allow this circumstance to keep us from being on the path necessary to do the things that we've set out.
And Senator, I want to assure you, NIH is doing everything within our power to allow flexibilities amongst our grantees in terms of ways that they can keep things going. Young investigators can have an extension on the timetable for their career next step and all of that. But it is still a heartbreaking situation to see the consequences.
Since I used most of my time to brag on Senator Alexander, I'm going to try to get another question in. And that is, we see and hear Dr. Fauci regularly. And tell me about the other institutes at NIH. What else? I didn't mean to discount him. My actual question is, what are the other institutes have to do with the pandemic? It wouldn't just be infectious diseases that are trying to help us solve this problem. I assume NIH across the board is engaged fully.
Absolutely. I convened all of the institute directors back in March and said, what could we do collectively that just one institute can't do, although certainly Tony Fauci's institute is in the lead. And every single one of our 27 institutes and centers has a significant role they would like to play, some of which they don't have resources for, but hope that perhaps it might be possible to obtain them. Such things as the Heart, Lung, and Blood Institute, since this is a lung disease, and they're actually running a trial right now of anticoagulants because that is the place, heart, lung, and blood, where they have the greatest expertise to be able to see if that can help people who are the most ill patients on ventilators and ICUs. The Genomics Institute is trying to figure out what's the difference between individuals that predicts who's going to get really sick after an exposure and who kind of shrugs it off. There's probably some big story to be learned there that could be useful, even in terms of figuring out who ought to be the highest priority to get a vaccine. I mentioned already child health and the importance of worrying about kids, but also about pregnant women. Certainly the health disparities issues that you've heard about are absolutely pressing, and we have expertise in that space as well. So it is all hands on deck with people designing programs, trying to figure out if there are ways that they can reallocate dollars in the very rapid turnaround, and hoping there's a way that they can expand that because of the great needs. So thanks for the question. It is very important and very much on everybody's minds at NIH.
I've utilized more than my goodwill, so I can't ask anybody else any other questions, but Dr. Disbrow and Dr. Redfield, I have issues and things I'd like to discuss with you, and I look forward to doing that when it becomes possible.
Senator Kennedy.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Gentlemen, I want to thank you for being here today. I want to thank you for your hard work. I know you've been under a lot of pressure. And I know this has been a learning process. And we're learning more each and every day. I don't know whether we're in the middle of a new surge or the first surge never ended. Doesn't really matter. But the American people are scared. They're scared not just about their health and their family's health. They're not just scared about dying. They're scared about their job. They're scared about their country. They're scared about their world. They're scared about their church. This is overwhelming for all of us, but they are really overwhelmed. And they're not morons. They're very intelligent. They don't have time, of course, because they're too busy earning a living, to read every day on the latest information. I want to echo my colleagues and strongly encourage you at some point to, if you haven't already, prepare a report, but also with your other colleagues, perhaps Dr. Birx, Dr. Fauci, set aside some time to talk straight to the American people. Tell them the truth, as I know you will. Under promise, over deliver. No spin. Explain where we are on vaccines. I'm encouraged by the progress that's been made. I think the speed is breathtaking. I'm impressed that the whole world is working together. And explain where we are in terms of delivering that vaccine if we develop it. You may have to do this in several different reports or press conferences, and I know this is an easy thing for me to suggest. There are others that will have input in terms of you holding a press conference, but I would do the same thing about therapeutics. People, as I've said a number of times, people aren't afraid of getting sick. They're afraid of dying. Now, nobody wants to get sick, but people would feel a lot better if they knew if they got sick, they're not likely to die. And I know they're not likely to die, but many people don't understand that. And that's where the therapeutics comes in. I would also encourage you to talk frankly to the American people about what they can do to make themselves as safe as possible. There's been a lot of misinformation about social distancing and masks. I think the information has been pretty consistent about good hygiene. But you gentlemen and others have credibility. And I would strongly encourage you to do that. And I want to thank you for your service. I mean that. Give the American people some hope, but tell them the truth. And I think there is hope out there. The other issue I wanted to talk about, but I'm not, we'll save it for another day. We've got to get our kids back to school. We've got to do it. And we need your help figuring out how to do it safely. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Senator Kennedy. I did notice a major pediatric group came out yesterday talking about for nutritional reasons, for socialization reasons, for the sanity of their parents, kids need to get back to school. It'll be the most likely touchstone that things are returning to normal if we can get that done. So, Dr. Collins, on the testing area, I'm concerned the dates I'm hearing don't seem to quite match up with millions of school kids and college kids taking tests multiple times when school starts that would be easily taken and quickly responded to. Do you want to talk about that for me just a little bit more?
I'll try. So currently, the way that testing has been progressing, you've seen substantial increases across the country now to the point where there more than 30 million tests have been administered, and we're at the point now where between 500,000 and 1 million tests are happening each day. But as I said earlier, many of those are circumstances that require a central laboratory and where the results may not come back for a day or two or three. What we're trying to do with RADx is to greatly enhance the ability for those kinds of point-of-care tests to be there. We are both looking at platforms that go into the Shark Tank and then have the opportunity for rapid expansion. We're also looking at a few things that are a little bit more advanced, but not advanced enough. They can sort of bypass the Shark Tank and go to the next phase in a program called RADx ATP for Advanced Technology Program. Some of those are also looking promising, and we are doing everything we can to pull them up into a higher throughput space. Again, we had said if this went really well, we'd have millions more tests per week by the end of the summer, beginning of the fall. I'm talking to Bruce Stromberg, who's the director of RADx and a very gung-ho engineer, as you know from having met with him. He believes that we could get to the point of an extra 1 million tests per day just from the RADx program by the 1st of September, by Labor Day. That is a heck of a stretch since we started this program at the end of April, but that's the trajectory we're on. But that would go fairly steadily upward then over the course of the next 2 or 3 months, so it might be more in the neighborhood of 5 to 10 million additional tests per day by December. That's our current projection. Again, taking the exhortation from Senator Kennedy about sort of under-promise and then over-deliver. I'm not trying to tell you what I think the absolute most amazing outcome would be. I think I'm trying to tell you what we could achieve and then hold us accountable and see if we can do it.
From elementary school to big university to an employer, are you thinking about cost as one of the things you're looking at and trying? I mean, I don't think these can cost $50 a test or $120 a test. I think we've got to be very cost conscious here in what we encourage. Is that?
That is absolutely part of the way each one of these platforms is being assessed. And if you have something that's like really cool technologically, but it costs $100, it's not clear to me that that's what we should be investing in right now. Now, of course, there are often times where somebody says it's going to cost $100, and once you actually get the Shark Tank folks involved, you find you can drive that price way down.
Right. Dr. Dispro and Dr. Redfield, I heard Dr. Dispro, in responding to another question, brought up the reality that when you have a vaccine, you have to have a package that allows that vaccine to be administered. I can't imagine the outrage if we had a vaccine and we need, let's say, a handful of items to be able to give that vaccine, and we only have 4 of them. I can't imagine how aggravated people would be starting right here if somehow we're not totally prepared for that. Tell me whose job that is to be sure that we have all of that in line so that not only can the vaccine be developed and delivered, but we have everything we need to be sure it can be administered.
Correct. Thank you for the question. And it is important to have an end-to-end plan for vaccine development and delivery. And so right now under Operation Warp Speed, the Strategic National Stockpile is working on the kitting of the vaccine, components.
I understand.
The components.
Mm-hmm. Go ahead.
I mean, they're the ones that are doing it, but again, under Operation Warp Speed, it is a continuum. So the people who are developing the vaccines, those working groups are letting them know, it's going to be a 5-dose vial, so you would need to send out, 7, needles, 7 syringes, 7 Band-Aids, 7 alcohol wipes, because you have to have excess overage, and we are all working together on that. But the SNS is putting together those kits.
And who's responsible for that?
The strategic
stockpile. Is that
correct?
Part of HHS? Is it part of BARDA?
So it's part of ASPR, the Assistant Secretary for Preparedness and Response. But again, under Operation Warp Speed, they are at the table as part of Operation Warp Speed.
All right, we're going to ask some questions of them about this topic then. Dr. Redfield, do you want to add anything to that?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. The only thing I would add, because it is important, we've done pandemic exercises, to prepare pandemics, and we have identified, as you pointed out, that everything was fine, but we didn't have enough needles, or everything was fine, we didn't have enough vials. So clearly that's been taken into account here with.
I hope so.
But the other area I want to just emphasize once again is don't underestimate the importance of making sure we have the cold chain capability, depending on what the restrictions are of the product, that product needs to be handled within that cold chain for that distribution.
Right, and some, as I believe I understand what we're trying to accomplish here, these various vaccines would have different levels of what they need to have to maintain their efficacy. And
that's correct.
Okay,
that's correct. Some of them that are there are going to require -80, which is a higher level cold chain requirement. Some may require less. So I just think it's important that we are preparing to make sure we have redundancy in our cold chain capability.
Dr. Disbrow, there may be more than one more COVID bill, but I think we should assume that between now and sometime very late this year, there's probably one more chance to get this right funding-wise. How much money do you need?
So I can't go on the record and say how much we need, but we will work with Congress and through our ASFR colleagues, our budget office at HHS, as additional needs are identified, to bring them quickly to you.
Well, so you're going to work that up through the Secretary?
Correct.
All right, we need to know that number, and we need to know that number pretty quick, and then we'll have a discussion about whether it's appropriate or not, but we need to be thinking about that. Dr. Redfield, do you want to talk about this topic? What do you need to enhance the flu vaccines at a level we haven't been able to encourage people to take them before? What do you need to use that network to see what your plan might be 60 days later for a vaccine network? What resources do you need that you will not have unless we provide them?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I want to echo, the sentiments of Chairman Alexander, just to go back to my view that now is the time to make the investment in the core capabilities of public health that this nation not only needs, but it deserves. That's a broad issue in terms of data modernization, the ability to have predictive data analysis, laboratory resilience, and the public health workforce. In terms of distribution of the vaccine, largely one of our key responsibilities, I think it's just important for people to realize that distributing a new vaccine to everyone in this nation is a complicated process, and it is going to take resources. It's not measured in the millions, it's measured in the billions. It's not like we're just going to send the vaccine off to a bunch of doctors' offices and it's all going to happen. So I do think it's important that we make that investment so that just like we're developing the vaccine at risk right now, when it's finished, the company's going to have enough to actually start to give it to the American public. We need the exact same thing for the distribution strategy. It was commented by Senator Murray and others. That process has to happen now. And it is going to take resources to build it.
Well, absolutely. We know we're going to have to, we have confidence we're going to have a vaccine. We know it's going to have to be distributed. We need to figure out what that plan is. There's no reason for that plan to wait any longer than we have to. We ought to have that plan put together right now that has the flexibility that allows you to deal with different vaccines from different locations in different ways. But right now is the time that ought to happen, and whoever you need to work through to get the information we need about what that's going to cost, we need to know that in the next couple of weeks.
Yes, sir.
Dr. Collins, I think we put $1 billion in Shark Tank and put other money in, substantial money at NIH for all of these the various divisions to be looking at what they need to do. What do you need next?
Well, I appreciate the question, and I'll consider this that you're asking for my professional judgment.
I am.
So I already mentioned in response to Senator Moran's question the desperate need that our grantee institutions have for what's happened as a result of COVID-19, and that the loss in research capabilities adds up to about $10 billion. That's part of it. We do have these trans NIH initiatives that have been developed over the course of the last few weeks that I do think would make major contributions to our advances here. There's about $1.6 billion in those projects that involve multiple institutes, and another $2.2 billion for specific institute initiatives that I think have very high value. And then on top of that, we also are thinking about whether there are ways that we could help with the economic difficulties in the country, because NIH, every dollar we give out, we know has a big stimulus for the economy. And we have an additional set of ideas there about things that would be shovel-ready that would add up to another $5 billion. Those are the things we've been thinking about.
Okay. And I think on the grantee front, I know we've been talking about the grants that were going to run out this year. Basically, they lost this year, an extension of those grants, some money to start laboratories back up,
yes,
and some absolute authority that the grants you didn't get to determine this year don't get lost in this process, and you have more time to do that. Would those three things all be correct?
That is very much correct, and appreciate your being so on top of those things. They're going to matter a lot.
Senator Alexander.
Thanks, Mr. Chairman. It's been a very helpful hearing for me. Learned a lot. Dr. Collins, Nashville Metropolitan Schools start August the 4th. And so do a lot of other schools in the South. They start, I know in the North they think that's uncivilized, but that's what we do. And so the relevance of that is to tests and treatments. As I said earlier, we've had a lot of talk about vaccines there down the road. Tests and treatments are upon us. And I get a sense, I can't prove it, but I hear that we're going to really need those point-of-care tests you're working on, and we're going to need them quickly. I hear lots of anecdotal stories about lab technicians that are overworked, machines that are overworked, about people who can, even in our state where the governor has said, if you want a test, go down to your public health department and get it. I get conflicting rumors that some public health departments say only if the doctor, says so. I hear stories of delays of 3, 4, 5 days before the diagnostic test comes back, and of course it's not very useful when it comes back several days late. So what I'm getting around to is I want to underscore the importance of your point-of-care tests, and I hope you will let Senator Blunt and the rest of us know if there's anything that we can do to accelerate your RADx effort, because creating millions of new tests a day that are point-of-care, rapid, quick, reliable. If, as Senator Blunt said, our surest path toward normalcy is when 75 million students go back to school and college. And it will build a lot of confidence in those schools and colleges if the schools and colleges can test as frequently as they want to, randomly, or every class, or every floor in a dorm, or as the Brown University president said, she wants to test every student before they come back. Okay, most campuses aren't going to do that, but she wants to. So if that's what builds the confidence to come back, your project is the answer to that, it seems to me. And I have the same confidence in it that I did earlier when Senator Blunt and others worked on it. Now let me, my other question is treatments. We're talking about going back to school, having the point-of-care tests, so you can test any student, any class, any teacher, whenever you want, is one thing. A second thing would be able to say, as I mentioned earlier, and to say in the preliminary meetings that come back to school. We're going to try to be open 5 days a week, and we want to assure the teachers and the administrators and the parents and the grandparents at home that when you come back, there are some specific medicines that are going to be available that will help make sure that your illness is not as severe and that you're less likely to die. Could you take a minute and just quickly list those? 2 or 3 of them are already approved. 2 or 3, like the antibody cocktails, are very promising. And what would those things do? I mean, like the remdesivir, if I've said that right, did I hear someone say that it decreases by 32% the amount of time to recovery? Right. That's important, specific information to someone.
Well, I totally agree with you. This is critical, and it's a major part of Operation Warp Speed. And I'm glad to say Janet Woodcock is now the leader of the therapeutic work stream for Operation Warp Speed, a very experienced scientist who knows how to get things done. It's a privilege to work with her. Yes, remdesivir has been approved, and it does reduce hospitalization, and it had...
So if I get sick, if I'm a parent, my kid comes home sick, is that available to me to help make my hospital stay shorter?
Remdesivir is produced by Gilead. The U.S. government has recently acquired large numbers of doses to make sure it's available. It is intravenous, so this is something that you save for people who are in the hospital and who are pretty sick, but that's where we know it works.
Okay, what else would reassure me?
Dexamethasone, which is a steroid, was shown in a study done in the UK, but we've worked closely with the UK all the way along and knew they were doing this. Basically showed a significant improvement in survival of people on ventilators and also people who are not on ventilators but who are on oxygen. So that's now become standard of care. So we have those too. But that's not nearly enough. We need to be able to push forward all these other things quickly that look like they could have promise. The active partnership of this that I described, public-private partnership, looked hard to see what would be the most important therapeutics to get prioritized because there were hundreds of ideas out there, and then try to get those into clinical trials. There is a trial coming soon of other immunomodulators, basically things to try to damp down the overreaction of the immune system that seems to happen in people who are very sick, particularly those in ICUs. There is a trial getting started very soon on anticoagulants because it's clear that this virus does something to make the blood overly clottable, and so it clots in the lungs and other places, and that can end up being a fatal outcome. We need to figure out how that works. And then there are all these immune systems like the antibody cocktails, the convalescent plasma, the hyperimmune globulin, all of those now being subjected to rigorous testing this summer as well in the United States.
And there's a possibility or a likelihood that some more of those will be available for parents, grandparents, teachers, administrators who might be infected.
We are going to push hard to get those trials to the point where you can draw a conclusion about their effectiveness by the end of the summer, early fall. That's really pushing the agenda, but it is the goal. And if I had to pick one, I think the monoclonal antibody cocktails have a lot going for them because we know they worked for Ebola, and there's all kinds of reasons to think this is the kind of virus it should work for too.
And you have several companies making those, right?
We do.
And if they work and are safe, you should be able to produce a lot of those. Is that
That'll
correct?
be part of the challenge, is the manufacturing. And here again, having Warp Speed involved thinking ahead of time about the manufacturing so we don't get to the point of having a successful trial and then have to wait a long time to scale it up. These all have to be done in big fermenters. BARDA is very engaged in that, as is NIH, as is the whole Warp Speed team. So we want to be sure if we have something that works, there's a lot of it out there.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Senator Alexander. Thanks to our witnesses. We've taken a lot of your time today. It's been very helpful to us. I think for those people at HHS who are here or who are following this hearing, I think we need more clarity in the next 2 weeks on specifically who's in charge of what are the deadlines, and what do you need to meet those deadlines and do the job that the country is counting on you to do. And we're going to help you do that, but we need answers to those 3 questions. The record on this
Mr. Chairman,
hearing,
may I comment on what you just said?
You can.
It reminds me of Admiral Rickover, who personally hired all of the commanders of the Navy nuclear subs from the 1950s. And he said to them, you've got 2 jobs. One is your ship and one is your reactor. And if anything happens to your reactor, your career is over. And he never had a problem with a reactor because he put somebody on the flagpole. So I think that's what you just said.
Well, we need to know, and we need to know in a hurry. And we can't be helpful if you don't tell us how to help. And we need these questions answered. So thank all of you. Thank you for sticking with me here. Senator Murray was with us right up till the end of this as well. The record will stay open for 1 week for additional questions. The subcommittee will stand in recess.